Distinguished Rector, members of the faculty, ladies and gentlemen, and also some personal friends whom I recognize in the audience and whom I'm delighted to see again. First of all, let me say how very honored I am to receive today the doctorate of this renowned, internationally recognized, and important institution. I'm familiar with its history and the role it has played in the intellectual life and in the national consciousness of the Ukrainian people. Founded many centuries ago, much earlier than most institutions in America, suppressed 202 years later, and then reborn some 175 years later. This institution is also a testimonial to the desire of the Ukrainian people to shape their own destiny, to define their identity, and to contribute to the common European heritage of which Ukraine is so very much an integral part. Anyone even remotely familiar with the history of Europe knows that this city here, 1,000 years ago, was already then a center of European culture, a center of learning, of thought, and also of searching for something beyond human existence, of searching for some definition of the meaning of life. So you're a part of an important tradition, and your renewal and vitality is a triumph of the spirit, as well as a source of satisfaction to your friends. And I consider myself one of your friends. Today I plan to speak to you about a very big subject, Ukraine and the world. And of course, all of you here know much more about that subject than I do, since the first word in the subject is Ukraine. So I want to add a qualification, namely that I will speak of Ukraine and the world as seen from the outside, as seen from far away, by someone who is interested in the condition of the world and who is interested in the place of Ukraine in that world. I consider Ukraine's independence to be truly a major historical event of great international significance. This was not appreciated at first, particularly in the West, and specifically in the United States. Even now, in my view, there is not sufficient international appreciation of the international significance of Ukraine. It has to be emphasized over and over again that an independent Ukraine has redefined the frontiers of Europe. And an independent Ukraine is transforming Russia into a national state. These are extraordinarily important developments. It is now a decade and a half since the turbulent days of the rebirth of your national independence. It is appropriate, therefore, to ask, what has been accomplished in those 15 years? And a great deal has been accomplished. First of all, Ukrainian independence has been consolidated internationally. Secondly, its territorial integrity has been preserved. One need only mention Crimea or Tuzla. Thirdly, Ukraine has carried out very effective and internationally positive nuclear disarmament. Fourthly, Ukraine has had a remarkably impressive presidential transition, and I speak particularly the elections which led from President Kravchuk to President Kuchma. Next, Ukraine's economic growth today, after some years, is now most impressive. Indeed, it is among the highest in Europe. And Ukraine, last but not least, is participating in peacekeeping in the Balkans and now in Iraq. And these are important contributions, and thus this is an impressive record. But we have to recognize that global conditions, as well as Ukrainians' own internal affairs, are still quite fluid. And let us take, therefore, a closer look at both global affairs and internal Ukrainian issues and consider their possible implications. If basic, currently ongoing, political, economic, and military trends continue for another 25 or 30 years, we're likely to see a world in which the global hierarchy of power, the global hierarchy of influential states, is likely to be as follows. At the top, there will still be the United States. Secondly, probably the most influential power will be the European Union, by then including both Turkey and Ukraine. Thirdly, it will be China. Fourth, it will be Japan. And fifth, it will be India. Notice this significant shift of global gravity, of the center of global gravity to Asia. In that setting, the democratic core of the world, the Atlantic community, will still be the principal impulse for innovation, the critical source of stability, and the point of origin of the radiating appeal of democracy. However, only if present trends continue, and they could be reversed or even derailed. And there are already some symptoms of mounting global disorder and some signs of basic misjudgments that give cause for prudent, cautious concern. Let me note, first of all, and it is not a criticism, but a statement of fact, that today America is more isolated, more mistrusted, and in some places, even more hated than ever before. America could even become bogged down in a huge portion of Eurasia, in an area from Suez to Xinjiang, from southern Russia to the Arabian Sea, an area that I call the global Balkans, especially if its engagement in that part of the world remains largely solitary. It is also not a prediction, but a real possibility that Europe's unification will continue to be largely socio-economic, with Europe remaining politically diffuse and inward-oriented, without a defined strategic vision of the larger world, and without the political will and the military means to genuinely influence the developments in the world, and without defining jointly with the United States common strategic goals. In that context, the engagement of Russia in a closer association with Europe might be diverted towards more traditional imperial goals, to the detriment both of democracy in Russia and of the national independence of some of Russia's recently emancipated but still vulnerable neighbors. One has to note also that it is far from certain that the wide gap between the trajectories of China's socio-economic transformation, which do produce more pluralism, and of its much slower political transformation, may not cause major political upheavals, which would be detrimental to the stability of the Far East. And last but not least, the growing access, not only by states, but by terroristic or criminal organizations, to weapons of mass destruction, in the setting of a percolating global turmoil and intense political resentments that cannot be understood merely by the repetitive invocation of the word terrorism, pose the risk of the progressive degradation of global order, as well as of the growing vulnerability of democratic societies. The cumulative effect of these negative tendencies could be escalating global chaos, detrimental particularly to weaker states. In that context, a closer connection between America and an expanding Europe is clearly needed. In essence, we need to promote the further expansion both of the European Union and of NATO. Neither political geography nor geostrategy are static concepts. They evolve, and the recent expansions of both organizations place now on the agenda the future status of Ukraine, of Turkey, and of the newly independent states of the Caucasus. Their eventual association will then facilitate the constructive engagement of Russia with its imperial option altogether then foreclosed. However, such a larger Atlantic community that includes Ukraine is not possible without Ukrainian efforts. Ukrainians themselves must overcome, and they must overcome themselves, the twin burdens inflicted upon them by the negative historical legacies of prolonged foreign domination and of destructive communism. Both have hindered the emergence of a pervasive Ukrainian patriotic civic consciousness, which is essential to democracy and independence. Both, I mean foreign domination and communism, both have created the tradition of state control over national resources, which in the new conditions of market economy has generated enormous opportunities for avarice by only a few self-enriching. Both precluded an established supremacy of law over politics, as well as over the disposition of national resources, thereby facilitating corruption. Last but not least, both have favored the habitual tendencies of bureaucrats and of those in power to control freedom of information, to stifle criticism, and to manipulate elections. The persistence of these negative tendencies are damaging Ukraine's good name in the world, and they are being exploited by outsiders to penetrate, manipulate, and weaken Ukraine's independence. When Ukrainians make a judgment about these domestic developments, they should not measure themselves by what has been happening in Russia. And they should not take refuge in the judgment that conditions in Russia in some respects may be worse. They should measure themselves by what has been happening in the Baltic republics or in Poland. If these negative trends within Ukraine were to intersect with some negative global trends that I've mentioned, Ukraine could become very similar to Poland of the 18th century. That is to say, like the Polish magnates, some sectors of the newly powerful and the newly rich could become seduced by Ukraine's more powerful neighbor, which could then exploit international instability, including the failure of America and Europe to work together, and exploit Ukraine's relatively still weak national consciousness to turn Ukraine into its satellite, even if not again into just its province. It follows, therefore, that we in the West must strive for a vital American-European partnership and build deliberately an Atlantic community that redefines the geography of Europe. And let us not forget that Central Europe of today was Eastern Europe just of yesterday. We must build an Atlantic community open to the new Eastern Europe, and not an Atlantic community which is closed and self-centered. The time is now ripe for the Atlantic community to focus with a sense of strategic purpose on the third phase of the Atlantic community's enlargement. The first phase, which we might call the Warsaw Round, enlarged NATO to parts of Central Europe, including Ukraine's immediate neighbor, Poland. The second phase, which we might call the Vilnius Round, resulted in the rest of Central Europe being included in both NATO and the European Union. The next phase, which I would like to call the Kiev Round, should look further east. June will provide such opportunities, especially the Istanbul NATO summit. And one desirable outcome in the not too distant future, if not in June, should be a membership action plan for Ukraine. In doing so, we in the West must recognize and respect Ukraine's accomplishments, but also be alert to its shortcomings. To make that possible, the Ukrainians must also, on their own, vigilantly consolidate a genuinely constitutional state in which there is no room for politically expedient constitutional manipulation. They must hold genuinely free presidential elections, thereby setting a contrasting example with recent experience in Russia. That these elections be free, that they be absolutely legitimate, is more important than who wins them. That the elections be free is more important than who wins them. And the world will watch closely and will draw its own conclusions. Ukrainians must also foster a civic society based on a deep social awareness of ancient Ukrainian traditions, which, as I said earlier, made Kiev at one point one of Europe's cultural and religious centers. Historically rooted patriotic pride can reinforce a self-confident civic society. Ukrainians, in that context, should increasingly see themselves as Central Europeans, as part of Central Europe, with which Ukrainians have much culturally in common, and with Russia now, the Eastern Europe of Europe. Ukrainians, last but not least, must protect freedom of the press and subordinate political life to the rule of law, both of which are essential components of democratic society, and in so doing, strive to meet the objective criteria for membership in the European Union and NATO. And all of that requires time and deliberate effort. I hope you will not be offended by my speaking so frankly, but I feel I have the right to do so because I have been a friend of your country for years, and I have been dedicated to your independence. I believe that your success will not only redefine Ukraine as one of Europe's leading nations, it will also set an important example for Russia, facilitating Russia's own road to Europe, and thus further redefining both Europe as well as Russia. And that in turn will further enhance the prospects for a genuinely better world. What you do in the near future and how you do it is therefore important to all of us who wish you well. Thank you. All right, the question is, how officials of European Union, high officials of European Union have announced that they do not see Ukraine as the European Union's member even in 20 years. Do you think it can change the strategy of Ukraine's foreign policy, focus on integration, influencing our vision of Ukraine as part of Europe? What you say about what high officials of Europe have said is true. They have said exactly what you cite them as saying. 10 years ago, they were saying that the Baltic republics will never be part of NATO or the European Union. 15 years ago, they were saying that Poland will never be part of NATO and of the European Union. Bureaucrats are not known for political imagination. But before you clap too much, let me remind you of something else. They did not change their minds about Poland or the Baltic republics because all of a sudden lightning hit their heads and they acquired political imagination. Why did they change their minds? Because the Poles and the Balts, the citizens of the Baltic republics, created objective conditions to which there had to be a response. Facts had to be realized. Don't wait for invitations from Europe or from NATO, because you will not get them. These are not clubs which go around inviting people to join. They are communities which accept countries when it is in the interest of the community to have those countries inside. And you have to create conditions that convince NATO, convince the European Union that it is in their interest to have you. I think it is, and I think we should be receptive, but it is really up to you. And therefore, how you handle your political life, how you handle your economic life will determine who you will be and where you will be. Maybe not even in 20 years, conceivably even in 10 years. What changes in US-Ukrainian relations may take place after the loss by Bush of the election campaign? I don't think there will be that much change, in part for reasons that I've already explained. The relationship between Ukraine and America is at least as much a function of what Ukraine does as it is of what America does. America in general is interested in a larger Europe, and America is interested in a partnership with Europe. America also doesn't want to see a zone of instability around Europe. And America welcomes additions to Europe that consolidate a larger zone of peace and progress, but also increase the probability of a partnership between Europeans and Americans. So I think that the policy itself will not change much. I think in our relationship, there is a lot of opportunity for expansion of specific relations. If I were in America, I would be more directly critical of some specific aspects of American policy towards Ukraine. But in general, I think that on both sides, there has to be a recognition of mutual interest in the expansion of a more constructive partnership. If Europe loses Ukraine now, what will it lose in the future? Well, it will lose two things. If Europe loses Ukraine, it will also lose Russia. And by losing both Ukraine and Russia, it will be less secure. So there is a European stake in a closer relationship with Ukraine, but Ukraine and Russia are not going to enter Europe at the same time. The differences between the two countries are significant, not only geographically, and there has to be a sequential process. And Ukraine's entrance into Europe will accelerate also, in the longer run, a more comprehensive and more satisfactory relationship between Europe and Russia.
Святослав Циволко, П'ятий канал. Пане Бжезінський, якщо в Україні, ви казали, важливіше не хто переможе на виборах, а як відбуватимуться, власне, вибори. Якщо вибори відбуватимуться недемократично, якщо вибори будуть не такими, не відповідатимуть ні європейським, ні американським, зрештою, ні західним стандартам, якою буде реакція Заходу? Тому що відомі, зрештою, приклади, коли навіть такі країни, як Пакистан, де відбувалися перевороти, Америка про лідерів цих держав, які приходили до влади недемократично, змінювала свою позицію стосовно них. Чи не може статися, що в разі, якщо в Україні відбудуться вибори недемократично, Америка знову ж таки змінить стосовно і цього лідерства свою позицію? Як реагуватимуть країни Заходу, якщо вибори відбуватимуться не по-західному в Україні?
Well, first of all, I don't think you should compare yourself even indirectly with Pakistan. The situation there is so different. I think you should ask yourself, what would have been the reaction of the United States if, for example, in the elections in Slovakia, a certain politician had won? I think the relationship would have been much cooler, much more distant. I think that, however, even more important than that is the character of the elections. Because if the elections are free and fair and legitimate, then no matter who wins them, it has a cumulative effect on the evolution of a democratic society. And Ukraine is an important country with which it is in the interest of Europe and of America to have a positive relationship. So we don't take a position on who wins your elections, because we are confident that if the elections are free and legitimate, that in itself will help to define the character of the regime that emerges from the elections, no matter who has won them.
Yes, I'm the student of Natural Department of Environmental Specialist, actually. So I ask environmental question. I see that America consumes too much and it goes wrong way. And as far as I see, Ukraine, we make Ukrainian development actually, because we are the future of Ukraine. And we see other way of development. It's not that high developed countries as they are already. What do you think, how America can change its way of development if it wants?
Well, first of all, it doesn't want.
Yeah, I see, but it needs,
Well,
as far as we see.
you may be right. I think in an abstract philosophical way, you may be right. But facts are facts. The vast majority of Americans like their lifestyle. They value their high consumption. and they're not particularly interested in fundamentally changing the way they live. Over time, I think there is developing an increasing consciousness about the environment, about consumption, and gradually I think there is going to be change. But it's not going to be dramatic, and it's only going to be decided by the American people themselves, because we are a democracy and we have certain traditions that we value. How would you comment on the recent elections in Mukachevo? Thank you very much. The question ends by saying thank you very much. I'm inclined to say thank you very much for the question. Well, clearly, there's a problem. I don't know how it will be resolved, but there's no doubt that there's a problem. And even if one doesn't agree about this or that specific, and even if one doesn't know, at least I don't know, how to determine responsibility for what happened, there is still a problem. And I think it is therefore important to face that problem, because in the eyes of many, this could be viewed as a symptom of a potentially larger problem. And it is obviously in the interest of Ukraine for Mukachevo not to become the symptom of a larger problem. So I think it is in the interest of everybody who accepts the idea that it is in the interest of Ukraine to have free and legitimate elections, to address this problem in a manner that restores confidence and that is reassuring regarding the future prospects of the electoral process in Ukraine.
Любомир Шавелюк, економічний факультет НаУКМА. Пане професоре, скажіть, будь ласка, чи буде після Афганістану і Іраку третя країна, чи може і не буде?
Well, whether dispatching your troops to Iraq with a smart move is your decision, not my decision. I am more responsible for what happens insofar as American actions are concerned. I personally, and I now speak as a private citizen, make a distinction between Afghanistan and Iraq. I think after what happened on September 11, 2001, the American reaction in Afghanistan was justified, given the fact that the source of the terrorism that struck at the United States was located in Afghanistan. I may also add that we have in Afghanistan a great many Afghan friends. And that's why the situation in Afghanistan is not so difficult. And we have friends in Afghanistan because we helped them in the 1980s to repel a foreign invasion from the north, the Soviet invasion. Our response in Afghanistan was designed to destroy the Al-Qaeda base, and in the process, therefore, to remove the Taliban. And by and large, from what I can judge, most Afghans approve both of these results. In the case of Iraq, my own view was that the argument for military intervention was not sufficiently credible, and that there was not an imminent danger requiring a solitary and unilateral American reaction. I recognized that the regime of Saddam Hussein was a serious problem, not only in human rights terms, but in relationship to stability in the Middle East, but that there was time to develop international consensus on this subject. There was time to develop a genuine UN-sponsored reaction to that problem. And therefore, I was critical of the unilateral character of the American intervention. I also recognize that the problem in Iraq today is much more difficult than the problem in Afghanistan. I personally feel that it would be in the interest of Iraq, of the United States, and of anyone involved in Iraq to see a more rapid internationalization of the existing political and security situation. I think an internationalization of that situation could accelerate the prospects for stability. And I think that countries which have decided to help the United States militarily should continue to do so, but should use their presence as partners of the United States militarily to also encourage the United States politically to more rapidly take actions to internationalize the political reality of Iraq. So my advice to you, since you asked me, is the same that I am giving, for example, in Poland, where the issue is also being debated, or in Italy, or in the Netherlands, which are the countries after America and Great Britain with the largest number of troops. Don't leave, but use your presence to encourage a more multilateral American policy, one that can more rapidly transform the political realities in Iraq in the direction of the internationalization of the common effort for a constructive solution. Why do you think Russia should transform to a national state while the United States is increasingly becoming the world gendarme or the evil empire? Well, there are really two parts to your question. One deals with Russia and one deals with America. There is no connection between these two questions, so I'll respond to each one of them separately. Russia is transforming into a national state because the non-Russian peoples that were part of the Tsarist Empire and of the Soviet Union prefer, in most cases, to have their own states. And I think it's perfectly natural and normal and justified. I also think that Russia will be more successful for its own people as a national state. I happen to remember a speech delivered in the center of Kiev in 1990 or 91, I think, by Boris Yeltsin, who told the Ukrainian people, but also indirectly told the Russian people, that nothing good has come for the Russian people from being the center of an empire. That being an empire causes costs and precipitates hatred, and that Russia has a better prospect for development, for normal life, for modernity as a national state. And I certainly think that Ukrainians will do better on their own. But I'm not in the position to urge you to be nationally independent if you don't want to be nationally independent. I don't know the person who sent this note, but if he or she wants to join Russia, you can either urge your fellow Ukrainians to join Russia, or you can simply pack your suitcase and move to Russia. As far as America is concerned, I don't think we are becoming the evil empire or the world gendarme. I happen to be critical of our policy in Iraq, but it's quite different from our policy in Afghanistan. And I still notice that people want to come to America. We don't have an emigration problem. We have an immigration problem. That tells you something, doesn't it? Who are these people who want to come to America all the time? Why do they want to go to this evil empire, if it's so evil? I wouldn't be surprised that the person who wrote me this note has some relatives in America. Did they go to an evil country because they're evil? I think America is a very interesting country, a very open country. It is not an infallible country. And we don't claim that we're infallible, that we're always right, that we are riding the wave of history, that the future is inevitably ours. But we have been very successful in building a very modern, very dynamic country to which more people want to go than to any other country in the world. By the time Russia, or I hope earlier, Ukraine becomes equally attractive, the person who wrote me this note will be in a better position to say what was said about America, but at this stage it's a little premature.
У мене два запитання. Перше, це одна з газет писала про вас таке. Искусство делать из бывших советских политических провинций, якобы самостоятельных геополитических игроков, важнейшее из всех искусств, которым Збигнев Бжезінський владеет в совершенстве, выдавая короткий поводок Вашингтона за самостоятельный выбор и самостоятельную политику нынешних стран СНГ. Як би ви могли прокоментувати такі слова?
Hey, I'm not sure if I understand the question, but if I understand it, let me say I disagree with a part of it, and I agree with a part of it.
Який імідж України в очах геополітичних діячів та американських геополітиків та американського естеблішменту?
Well, to some extent, I tried to answer that question in the beginning of my speech when I spoke about the importance of Ukraine in terms of global geopolitics. But if you specifically are asking about the image of Ukraine currently, then I have to say that it has somewhat deteriorated over the years. At first, there was a great deal of ignorance in America or in the West about Ukraine. In fact, 25 years ago, most people in the West thought that the Soviet Union was Russia and that Russia was the Soviet Union. There was very little understanding that the non-Russian nations amounted to about 1/2 of the population of the Soviet Union. Then there was a period of what we might call high expectations about Ukraine's transformation. Some hope that it will be as extensive and as rapid as that, for example, of Poland. And then, more lately, there has been a tendency to emphasize more the shortcomings and the difficulties of Ukraine. There is not enough awareness right now, for example, that your economic growth is very impressive. There is some skepticism about the extent and durability of democratic institutions in Ukraine. And this is why the presidential elections are so important, because they can affect your image. But if your presidential elections are really fair and legitimate, then that, plus the effects of good economic growth, I think within a year or so, will begin to transform in a very positive way Ukraine's image.
Скажіть, будь ласка, на вашу думку, висловлювання європейських політиків щодо виключення України, тобто неможливості України вже входити в Європейський Союз, не нагадують вам політику самоізоляціонізму Америки 20-30-х роках нашого століття, що привело до того, що в Європі відбувалися війни, і це, власне, привело до того, що світ розколовся, власне, на дві половини і привело до холодної війни. Дякую.
Well, I already mentioned earlier that I thought these views showed lack of political imagination, that they are the inevitable consequence of preoccupation with immediate problems. And I think they'll change if Ukraine is successful politically and economically. However, I would not compare the consequences of such negative views to perhaps the connection between American isolationism and World War II. I do not see a cataclysm developing on that scale. But certainly if the changes in Ukraine are not sufficiently attractive and impressive to prompt the European Union and NATO to welcome Ukraine, then the consequences in this part of the world will be negative. They'll be negative for Ukraine. I happen to think they'll also be negative for Russia, because they will perpetuate then the new but existing border between the European Union and everything east of the European Union. And what will be east of the European Union will then probably be less stable, less modern, less democratic.
Дмитро Колчинський, журналістська програма. Питання таке. Нещодавно в інтернеті з'явилося повідомлення, говорилося про те, що ця стаття є звітом ЦРУ щодо майбутнього Росії. Основною такою тезою було те, що в результаті Росія розпадеться на декілька держав, там певна кількість їх, здається, 9 чи 8. А чи є під цим якесь підґрунтя, так би мовити, rational, англійською мовою?
Basically, no. I don't think Russia is going to split into 8 parts or 5 parts or whatever. I do think, however, that after the present leadership in Russia has been changed and people with more experience in the West, more Western education, more awareness of the necessity of Russia becoming closer to the Atlantic community, the effect will be some significant decentralization of Russia. I do think that a highly centralized system of government makes Moscow essentially a somewhat parasitic center of power that drains too much of foreign investment to Moscow itself, to the detriment of Russia's provinces. I mean, life elsewhere outside of Moscow, outside of St. Petersburg, is not changing as much as it should. And largely because the system prevents regional initiative from taking advantage of regional opportunities, whether in the Primorsky Krai in the Far East, vis-à-vis Korea, Japan, China, or whether in St. Petersburg, vis-à-vis Scandinavia and the Baltic republics, etc. I think a centralized system stifles initiative. America wouldn't be today what it is if everything was decided in Washington.
There is no rationale behind the statement that it can split.
Well, I don't think it's going to split, but I think decentralization will be a necessity, and democratization of Russia's leadership will make those people in the political leadership in Moscow less fearful and more tolerant of decentralization. There is no national ethnic basis for a split into 8 parts, but I think there is a great deal of socio-economic need for decentralization.
Олег Карп'як, Києво-Могилянська академія. Пане Бжезінський, скажіть, будь ласка, з ким із українських політиків ви пов'язуєте наше європейське майбутнє? Дякую.
Well, I know great many Ukrainian political leaders, and the one that I strongly favor in the future is the one that in free elections gets the most votes.
Evgeny Mikhin, channel STB. I would like to say that next week, it seems to me, George Bush will come to Kyiv. I mean, the older one, ex-president. So, is there any question you would like to ask him, being a journalist? And if there's such a question, so what is it?
I have no question to ask George Bush Sr., but I think the fact that he's coming here and he'll speak here is symbolically important because he has spoken here before.
Thanks.